The eternal night of Vajrax glittered with a million stars as Sarah Chen stood in the grand marketplace, her heart steady despite the heavy chains around her wrists. The disguise was perfect, traditional Earth clothing modified to look worn, her diplomatic corps insignia carefully hidden beneath a layer of artificial dirt. Around her, actual slaves from dozens of worlds wept or stared blankly, but Sarah kept her posture straight and her gaze alert. The Vajraxian royal guards towered over the crowd, their iridescent scales shifting colors under the market's bright lights. Their presence meant only one thing: the young queen herself was coming to make a selection. Sarah silently thanked her superiors for their thorough intelligence. Everything was going according to plan. Queen Zixka emerged from her hover transport, her royal robes rippling like liquid starlight. At only 22 cycles old, roughly equivalent to a human's early 20s, she was the youngest queen in Vajraxian history. The crowd fell silent as she moved through the market, her 4 eyes scanning each potential purchase with careful consideration. "Your Majesty," one of her advisors, an elderly Vajraxian named Ventok, gestured toward a section of particularly expensive slaves, perhaps one of the Centaurians. "They have served the royal family for generations." The queen's head frills twitched, a sign of annoyance that Sarah recognized from her briefings. "No, Ventok, I wish to see the humans." A murmur ran through the crowd. Humans were rare in the slave markets, not because they were particularly valuable, but because Earth had managed to avoid most conflicts that typically led to captives. Sarah was, in fact, the only human in the entire marketplace. The queen stopped in front of Sarah, all 4 eyes blinking in sequence, a sign of curiosity. "This one," she said, her translator converting her clicks and whistles into standard galactic. "She stands differently than the others." Ventok's scales darkened with concern. "Your Majesty, humans are unpredictable. There are stories of their peculiar behaviors, their strange customs. Perhaps—" "Silence," Queen Zixka commanded, her head frills fully extended. "I have made my choice. Process the transaction." Sarah maintained her composure as the guards approached with scanning devices, checking for weapons or tracking devices. They would find none. The diplomatic corps' equipment was far too advanced to be detected by Vajraxian technology. The transaction was completed quickly. Sarah noted how the queen used her own private accounts rather than royal funds, another piece of intelligence confirming their theories about the young monarch's independent streak. As they led Sarah to the royal transport, she caught fragments of conversation between the queen and her advisors. "Most irregular, Your Majesty. The summit approaches, and you have yet to learn. First time hosting such an event requires traditional approaches." The queen silenced them with a gesture as Sarah was brought aboard. The interior of the transport was surprisingly comfortable, with cushioned seating and climate control adapted for various species. "You will serve in my private chambers," the queen announced, speaking directly to Sarah for the first time. "I require assistance with certain matters." Sarah lowered her eyes respectfully, hiding a small smile. The intelligence had been correct. The queen was desperately seeking help preparing for her first diplomatic summit, but ancient law required all royal advisors to be classified as slaves to maintain the fiction of absolute monarchy. "Yes, Your Majesty," Sarah replied in carefully accented standard galactic, making sure to sound like someone who had learned the language in border trading posts rather than diplomatic academies. As the transport lifted off toward the royal palace, Sarah caught the queen watching her with an expression that, despite the alien features, clearly showed relief. Whatever the young monarch was planning, she needed help, and humanity was about to demonstrate exactly why they had become the galaxy's rising diplomatic power. The palace grew larger in the viewport, its crystalline spires reaching toward the stars. Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Phase 1 of the mission was complete. Now came the challenging part, helping the young queen revolutionize an empire while pretending to be a simple slave. At least things wouldn't be boring. The royal palace of Vajrax was even more impressive from the inside. Sarah followed Queen Zixka through corridors of shifting crystal, trying to memorize the layout while appearing appropriately submissive. Other servants and slaves pressed themselves against the walls as they passed, their heads bowed low. "These will be your quarters," the queen announced, gesturing to a door that slid open at her approach. Sarah's eyes widened. Instead of the expected servant's cell, she found herself looking at a luxurious suite that would put Earth's finest hotels to shame. "There seems to be a mistake, Your Majesty," Sarah said carefully. "These chambers are too grand for a slave." The queen's head frills rippled with what Sarah recognized as amusement. "My advisors believe I am keeping you close for traditional purposes. Let them think what they wish. The summit is in 30 days, and I need someone who understands multi-species diplomacy." Sarah maintained her confused expression, but internally she smiled. The queen was sharper than their intelligence had suggested. "I don't understand, Your Majesty. I'm just a member of Earth's diplomatic corps." Queen Zixka's 4 eyes blinked in sequence. "Please, I did not choose you randomly. Your kind are terrible liars. Your posture alone speaks of years of diplomatic training." For a moment, Sarah considered maintaining her cover, but the queen's trilling laugh stopped her. "Do not worry. Your true identity is safe with me. I needed someone my advisors would underestimate, and a human slave is perfect. They already think I'm foolish for choosing you." Sarah straightened up, dropping the submissive pose. "Then you know why I'm really here. To help modernize the Vizraxian Empire, yes." The queen moved to a window overlooking the capital city. "My people cling to traditions that are choking us. This upcoming summit is my chance to change things." But her head frills drooped slightly. "I have never even spoken to most of these species." "That's why you arranged for me to be in the market," Sarah realized. "You needed someone with actual diplomatic experience, but tradition prevents you from officially hiring foreign advisors." "Precisely." Queen Zixka turned back to Sarah. "Though I admit, I didn't expect Earth to cooperate so thoroughly with my plan." Before Sarah could respond, an alarm chimed softly. The queen's scales shifted to a deeper purple, a sign of annoyance. "The traditional faction leaders demand their daily audience," she explained. "Normally, they spend hours lecturing me about proper behavior for the summit. Perhaps you'd like to observe." Sarah caught the gleam in the queen's eyes. "You want me to study your opposition. You catch on quickly. For a slave," the queen said, her voice carrying just enough volume to be heard by the guards outside. Then, more quietly, "Watch everything. Learn their patterns. Help me find a way to outmaneuver them without causing a civil war." The audience chamber was a massive hall decorated with holographic recreations of ancient Vizraxian battles. 5 elderly Vizraxians, their scales dulled with age, sat in ornate chairs while the queen perched on her crystalline throne. Sarah knelt nearby, seemingly subservient but missing nothing. "The Arcturus delegation expects traditional greeting rituals," one elder droned. "You must perfect the 7 forms of imperial dominance before." "The Arcturans abandoned those rituals 30 years ago," Sarah whispered, just loud enough for the queen to hear. "They consider them offensive now." Queen Zixka's head frills twitched slightly, the Vizraxian equivalent of a suppressed smile. "Perhaps," she interrupted the elder, "we should consider more current diplomatic protocols." The elder's scales flushed with anger. "Your Majesty, surely you aren't taking advice from a slave." "Of course not," the queen replied smoothly. "I merely recalled something from my studies. Please continue." As the elder resumed his lecturing, Sarah caught the queen's subtle wink with her lower right eye. For the first time, she felt real hope for their mission. This young queen wasn't just playing at change. She was ready to revolutionize her entire empire. She just needed humanity's help to do it properly. 2 weeks into her stay at the palace, Sarah was beginning to understand why Queen Zixka needed help so desperately. The young monarch sat across from her in the private study, attempting to practice the traditional greeting for the Andromean delegation. Her head frills were twisted in frustration. "No, no," Sarah said gently. "The Andronians don't just look at body language. They sense electromagnetic fields. Your frustration is literally lighting up the room to them." "How do humans manage to stay so neutral?" the Queen asked, her scales shifting to a troubled green color. Before Sarah could answer, the study door burst open. 3 members of the traditional faction stormed in, led by Elder Ventok. His scales were almost black with rage. "Your Majesty," he hissed, "you cannot keep spending so much time with this creature. There are rumors." The Queen rose to her full height, her head frills extending to their maximum width, a sign of royal authority. "I will spend my time as I see fit, Elder." Suddenly, Sarah noticed a slight shimmer in the air behind the Queen. Her diplomatic training included advanced combat scenarios, and she recognized the telltale signs of a cloaking device. Without thinking, Sarah launched herself forward, tackling the Queen just as a plasma blade sliced through the space where she had been standing. The hidden assassin's cloak flickered, revealing a sleek combat suit of unknown design. The elders backed away in shock, but Sarah was already moving. She rolled to her feet, grabbing a ceremonial staff from the wall. Years of mandatory combat training in the diplomatic corps took over. The assassin was fast, but they clearly weren't expecting a slave to fight back. Sarah deflected the plasma blade with the staff's energy-resistant metal, then swept the attacker's legs out from under them. In 3 precise moves, she had them pinned, their weapons skittering across the floor. Royal guards burst into the room, quickly securing the assassin. Sarah helped the Queen to her feet, suddenly aware that she had just shattered her submissive slave persona completely. The Queen's scales had shifted to a bright, shimmering pattern Sarah had never seen before. "Remarkable," she said, looking at Sarah with all 4 eyes wide. "Simply remarkable." Elder Ventok seemed to have trouble speaking. "Your Majesty, this slave, she can't possibly." "Oh, be quiet, Ventok," the Queen snapped. "If you spent less time worrying about tradition and more time paying attention, you'd have noticed that my slave moves like a trained diplomatic security officer." Sarah tensed, but the Queen wasn't finished. "Did you really think I chose her randomly? Humans aren't just known for their diplomacy, they're famous for hiding their true capabilities. While you were all dismissing her as a simple slave, she was actually the perfect bodyguard." The other elders murmured among themselves. Sarah could see the shift in their expressions, from dismissal to cautious respect. The Queen turned to the guards. "Take the assassin to the high-security cells, and send investigators to find out who they work for." She paused, then added with a hint of satisfaction, "Have them check the Centaurian embassy first." After everyone else had left, the Queen's formal posture relaxed. "Well, that was exciting. Though I suspect you didn't mean to reveal your combat skills quite so dramatically." Sarah shrugged. "Protecting you was more important than maintaining cover. Though I have to admire how quickly you spun it into a story about your own cleverness in choosing me." "One must take advantage of opportunities when they arise," the Queen said, her head frills rippling with amusement. "And now the traditional faction has seen that humans are far more than they appear. Perhaps they'll be more open to modernization." Sarah picked up the fallen ceremonial staff, admiring its balance. "We should probably add some combat practice to your diplomatic training, just in case." The Queen's scales shifted to a bright, eager pattern. "Excellent idea. After all, what better way to understand other species than to learn how they fight?" As they began clearing space for a practice area, Sarah sent a quick mental thank you to her combat instructors back on Earth. Sometimes the best diplomacy required a bit of well-placed violence, as long as you could justify it properly afterward. The week before the summit, the royal palace was in chaos. Delegations from 12 different species were arriving daily, and the traditional faction was having collective nervous breakdowns over each arrival. Sarah watched from her position near the Queen's throne as Elder Ventok burst into the reception hall, his scales a sickly yellow color. Your Majesty, the Proximan delegation is requesting permission to land, but they're using a new ship class that doesn't match our ancient recognition protocols. Queen Zixka, looking remarkably calm, glanced briefly at Sarah before responding. Allow them to land in the new diplomatic bay, the one with the adaptable docking systems. But the traditional landing zones are too small for modern ships, the Queen finished firmly. Unless you prefer to explain to the Proximans why we can't accommodate their official diplomatic vessel. Sarah hid a smile. The Queen had been practicing that tone of authority for weeks, and it was working perfectly. Even Ventok's scales shifted to a submissive pale blue as he bowed and retreated. Later in the private study, the Queen was reviewing diplomatic profiles on a holographic display while Sarah pointed out key details. Remember, the Proximan ambassador has 3 personalities sharing one body. Sarah explained. Address them as voices of harmony collectively, but watch their eye color to know which personality is dominant. And the Arcturan delegation? The Queen asked. They've abandoned their old dominance rituals. They now prefer quiet contemplation and mathematical poetry. I've prepared some simple equations that translate to complements in their cultural framework. A soft chime interrupted them, a secret signal from their allies in the modern faction. Moments later, a young noble named Kickstall entered, her scales shimmering with excitement. Your Majesty, honored advisor, she said, carefully avoiding the word slave in private. We've discovered something about the assassination attempt. The Queen's head frills perked up. Report. The assassin wasn't hired by the Centaurians as we thought. They were paid by members of our own traditional faction, the ones most opposed to the summit. Sarah watched the Queen's scales shift through several colors before settling on a deep, determined purple. Do you have proof? Kickstall produced a data crystal. Everything is here. Financial records, communications, planning documents. They were so confident in their traditions that they didn't even use modern encryption. The Queen was quiet for a long moment, all 4 eyes blinking in sequence as she thought. Perfect, she finally said. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Perfect. Don't you see? The Queen's head frills were practically dancing with excitement. They've given us exactly what we need. The traditional faction is always talking about honor and proper behavior. What could be less honorable than hiring assassins? Understanding dawned on Sarah's face. You're going to expose them at the summit. In front of every major diplomatic delegation, the Queen confirmed. They'll have to step down in disgrace, and we can replace them with younger, more progressive nobles. It's risky, Sarah cautioned, if even one delegation sides with tradition over progress. That's why I have you, the Queen said simply. Your human talent for improvisation, combined with our careful preparation. She turned to Kickstall. Gather the modern faction. We have 3 days to plan this perfectly. After Kickstall left, the Queen's formal posture softened slightly. Are you ready for this? Once we make our move, there's no going back. Sarah thought about her mission briefing back on Earth. Help modernize the Vizraxian Empire without causing a civil war. This wasn't exactly what her superiors had in mind, but sometimes the best diplomatic solutions required bold action. I'm ready, she said. Though I suggest we keep practicing those diplomatic greetings. We want everything else to be perfect when we drop this political bomb. The Queen's scales shifted to a pattern that Sarah had learned meant determined amusement. Indeed, though I suspect this summit is going to be far more interesting than anyone expected. That's one way to put it, Sarah muttered, already mentally preparing for what promised to be the most dramatic diplomatic event in recent galactic history. The morning of the summit arrived with 3 suns rising over the crystalline spires of the royal palace. Sarah stood beside Queen Zixka's preparation chamber, watching as royal attendants adjusted the Queen's formal robes. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation. The Arcturan delegation has arrived early, reported Kickstall, hurrying into the chamber. And Elder Ventok is already trying to force them through the traditional greeting ceremonies. The Queen's scales rippled with what Sarah now recognized as suppressed laughter. "Perfect. Is everything else ready?" "Yes, Your Majesty. The evidence is prepared, and our allies are in position." Sarah checked her own appearance in a nearby mirror. Instead of her usual simple clothes, she wore an elegant hybrid uniform that combined Earth diplomatic style with Vizraxian royal service markings. The Queen had insisted on it, calling it the first symbol of our new era. "Remember," Sarah said quietly to the Queen, "when I step forward, you'll formally announce your true identity." The Queen finished, triggering the traditionalists into making a scene. Meanwhile, Kickstall will be distributing the evidence of their assassination plot to all delegation leaders. Her head frills twitched mischievously. "We've only practiced this sequence 50 times, dear advisor." A deep tone echoed through the palace, the formal announcement that all delegations had arrived. The Queen straightened, her scales shifting to royal purple, and led their procession toward the Grand Hall. The sight was breathtaking. 12 different species filled the massive chamber, their various environmental suits and natural forms creating a living rainbow. The traditional faction stood to one side, their scales showing mixed patterns of anxiety and smugness. They clearly thought they still controlled the situation. Queen Zixka took her place on the crystal throne, with Sarah kneeling beside her in the traditional slave position one final time. The ceremony began with the traditional Vizraxian welcome chant. Just as Elder Ventok stepped forward to begin the lengthy traditional protocols, the Queen raised her hand. The entire hall fell silent. "Honored delegates," she began, her translator perfectly modulating her voice. "Today marks a new era for the Vizraxian Empire. And new eras require truth." She gestured to Sarah. "Rise and show them who you really are." Sarah stood smoothly, removing the simple collar she'd worn as part of her disguise. "I am Sarah Chen, Senior Diplomatic Officer of Earth's Interstellar Court, assigned as Special Advisor to Her Majesty." The traditional faction erupted exactly as planned. "Treachery!" Ventok shrieked, his scales turning almost black. "The Queen has betrayed our ways. She brings aliens into our most sacred, like the alien assassin you hired to kill me." The Queen interrupted coldly. The hall exploded into chaos as Kickstall's assistants distributed datapads containing the evidence to each delegation. The traditionalists' scales turned pale with horror as their plot was exposed. But Sarah noticed something they hadn't planned for. The Arcturan ambassador was rising, their crystalline form glowing with what seemed like approval. "Fascinating," the Arcturan's translator chimed. "Your Majesty has demonstrated perfect mathematical poetry, using the traditionalists' own actions to prove the need for change. We approve." One by one, other delegation leaders voiced their support. The Proximan's 3 personalities spoke in harmony about the wisdom of adaptation. The Centaurian hive mind hummed with appreciation for the strategic elegance. Elder Ventok and his supporters could only watch as their power crumbled. Royal guards moved to arrest those implicated in the assassination plot, while others were simply escorted from the chamber in disgrace. And now, the Queen announced, her scales shining with triumph, "Let us discuss the future. A future where tradition guides us, but does not chain us. Where wisdom from all cultures is valued." She gestured to Sarah, starting with the abolition of the slave system, replacing it with a formal diplomatic advisory program. As the delegations erupted in approving gestures from dozens of different species, Sarah caught the Queen's lower right eye wink at her. They'd done it. Transformed an empire without firing a shot. Well, except for that one assassin. But nobody was counting that. The summit's first official day was a whirlwind of activity. With the traditional faction removed, Queen Zixka was free to implement her new diplomatic approach, and Sarah watched with pride as her students shone. "Your cultural exchange proposal is intriguing," the Proximan voices of harmony said, their eye color shifting through their 3 personalities. "But how will you ensure fair treatment of all participants?" The Queen's head frills moved confidently as she responded. "We will adopt elements of the Earth model, combined with our own strengths. Former slaves will become honored advisors, with full rights and diplomatic status. Sarah stood at her proper place now, not kneeling as a slave, but standing as an official Earth representative. She noticed how other delegations kept glancing at her with newfound respect. Humans had just proven themselves far more clever than anyone had suspected. A question buzzed the Centaurian hive mind representative. How did Earth know to send exactly the right person at exactly the right time? The Queen's scales flickered with amusement. They didn't. I chose Sarah from their diplomatic corps because humans have a reputation for adaptability. The fact that she exceeded all expectations was— She paused for effect, the delightful bonus. Suddenly, alarms blared through the chamber. Security screens flickered to life, showing chaos in the city below. Crowds were gathering, led by supporters of the traditional faction. Your Majesty, Kixtall rushed in, her scales pale with worry. The traditionalists are claiming you've been mentally controlled by the human. They're demanding your removal from the throne. The delegates began murmuring nervously. Sarah could see their carefully built alliance starting to crack under pressure. But before she could speak, the Queen did something unprecedented. She laughed. The sound echoed through the chamber, making everyone freeze. Mental control, she said, still chuckling. Perhaps we should demonstrate how well humans actually influence me. Sarah, what do you think I should do about this riot? Sarah knew this was a test, not just of her, but of their entire strategy. Your Majesty, I think you should ignore my advice completely and handle this in true Vizraxian style. The Queen's scales rippled with delight. Excellent suggestion, which I will now completely disregard. She turned to the security screens. Open a city-wide broadcast channel. As the technicians scrambled to obey, the Queen stood, her royal robes shimmering. Watch, she told the delegates, as I demonstrate why new ways can honor old traditions. Her image appeared on screens throughout the city. The crowds below fell silent, waiting. People of Vizrax, she began, her head frills fully extended in traditional royal display. You fear we are abandoning our ways. Look at me. I stand before you in the royal robes, my scales showing the purple of our ancestors. I am your queen. Her voice grew stronger. But being queen means protecting our future, not just our past. The galaxy is changing. We must change with it, or we will be left behind. Those who claim I am controlled by aliens cannot explain why every decision I make puts Vizrax first. She gestured to the assembled delegates. Look, 12 species stand with us, ready to trade, to share knowledge, to make us stronger. The traditionalists offer only fear. I offer you the stars. On the security screens, the crowds began to shift. The angry shouts turned to contemplative murmurs. Sarah saw the exact moment when the Queen's words began to sink in. Choose, the Queen concluded. Choose between fear and hope, between past and future. I am your Queen, and I choose to lead us forward. The response started slowly, a few citizens raising their hands in the traditional salute of loyalty. Then more, and more. Within minutes, the riot had transformed into a celebration. The Arcturan ambassador's crystalline form glowed brightly. Most impressive, you've transformed a challenge into a demonstration of leadership. No, the Queen corrected gently, her scales showing a new pattern Sarah had never seen before, one that somehow combined traditional royal purple with something entirely new. I've transformed an empire. She glanced at Sarah with all 4 eyes. With a little help from my friends. The delegates burst into their various forms of applause, while below, the city continued to celebrate. Change had come to Vizrax, and there would be no going back. 3 days into the summit, the royal palace had transformed. Where once there were only Vizraxian guards and servants, now representatives from all 12 species worked together, sharing knowledge and creating new protocols. Sarah sat in what had once been the traditional faction's meeting room, now converted into an interstellar communication center. Screens showed news from across the galaxy, all talking about the Vizraxian Revolution. Your human media is particularly excited, Queen Zixka said, entering the room with her scales glowing a happy blue-green. They're calling it the most bloodless regime change in galactic history. Mostly bloodless, Sarah corrected with a smile, remembering the assassin. Though I'm more interested in today's agenda. Are you ready for the big announcement? The Queen's head frills twitched nervously. Converting our entire slave system into an interstellar cultural exchange program is ambitious. Even with the traditional faction gone, many nobles are hesitant. Then let's show them the benefits, Sarah suggested, pulling up a holographic display. The Proximan delegation has already pledged 50 of their finest scientists. The Arcturans are offering mathematical experts. Even the Centaurian hive mind wants to participate. A soft chime announced Kixtol's arrival. The young noble's scales were shimmering with excitement. Your Majesty, the Earth Council has sent their response. The Queen activated the message. A hologram of the Earth Council chairman appeared, his expression serious but pleased. Queen Zixka of Vizrax, he began formally. Earth accepts your proposal for a full cultural exchange program. We are prepared to send teachers, scientists, artists, and diplomatic advisors. In return, we would be honored to host Vizraxian cultural experts in our institutions. Sarah watched the Queen's scales shift through patterns of joy and relief. This was what they had worked for, not just ending the slave system, but replacing it with something better. There's more, Kixtol added. 3 other empires have contacted us. They want to know if they can adopt our new system. They're calling it the Vizraxian model of cultural integration. The Queen turned all 4 eyes to Sarah. It seems humans aren't the only ones who were waiting for a chance to modernize their traditions. Before Sarah could respond, the chamber's main screen lit up with an urgent message. The Arcturan ambassador requested an immediate audience. When the crystalline being entered, its form was glowing with unusual intensity. Your Majesty, it chimed, we have detected multiple ships entering the system. They appear to be traditionalist supporters from other empires. Sarah felt her diplomatic training kick in. They're coming to protest the changes. If other empires are considering adopting our model, then their own traditional factions feel threatened, the Queen finished. Her scales shifted to a determined purple. Good. Good? Sarah and Kixtol asked simultaneously. Of course. The Queen's head frills spread in a gesture of confidence. What better way to prove our new system works than by handling this diplomatically? She turned to Sarah. How would Earth handle this situation? Sarah thought for a moment. We'd invite them to observe. Let them see the benefits firsthand. Maybe even offer them positions in the exchange program. Perfect. The Queen activated the palace's communication system. Attention all diplomatic delegates. We are about to receive some unexpected guests. I believe this is an excellent opportunity to demonstrate our new approach to interstellar relations. As the palace burst into activity, preparing for the new challenge, Sarah noticed something remarkable. Species that had been enemies for generations were working together, sharing ideas, solving problems. And at the center of it all was a young queen who had dared to imagine something better. You know, Sarah said quietly to the Queen, when I agreed to this mission, I thought we'd be lucky to change one empire. The Queen's scales sparkled with all the colors of her 3 sons. My dear friend, I think we're about to change the entire galaxy. Looking at the unity and purpose around them, Sarah couldn't help but agree. Sometimes the biggest revolutions started with the smallest deceptions, like a human pretending to be a slave or a queen pretending to follow tradition. 1 month after the summit began, the royal palace hosted its final ceremony. The Great Hall was packed with representatives from not just the original 12 species, but delegates from 20 other empires who had come to learn about the Vizraxian model. Sarah stood proudly beside Queen Zixka's throne, wearing her new official uniform, a perfect blend of Earth diplomatic corps and Vizraxian royal advisor styles. Around them, Former slaves from dozens of worlds wore similar uniforms, each modified to honor both their original culture and their new status. "Who would have thought," the queen said softly, her scales shimmering with joy, "that my plan to buy one clever human would lead to this?" The queen's head frills twitched with amusement as she watched even the traditionalist ship's delegates mingling with the crowd. After seeing the success of the cultural exchange program, they had requested to join rather than fight it. Their own empires were already beginning similar reforms. "Honored guests," the queen announced, her voice carrying across the hall. "Today we celebrate not just the end of an old system, but the birth of a new age of cooperation." She gestured to Sarah. "Our friend from Earth taught us that true strength comes not from dominating others, but from learning from them." Sarah stepped forward, still amazed at how far they'd come. "The Earth Council has approved the establishment of the Interstellar Cultural Exchange Academy here on Vajrax. Every species will be welcome to teach and learn." The Proximan voices of harmony spoke next, their three personalities in perfect sync. "Our scientists have already begun collaborating with Vajraxian crystal tech experts. The advances we've made in 1 month surpass decades of separate research." The Arcturan ambassador's crystalline form pulsed with approval. "Our mathematical poetry has found new inspiration in Vajraxian color language. We are creating entirely new forms of communication." Even the Centaurian hivemen contributed, their unified voice humming with satisfaction. "The efficiency of cooperative learning exceeds all projected models. We calculate a 300% increase in technological and cultural advancement rates." Kickstall, now serving as the head of the new Cultural Integration Office, approached the throne with a data crystal. "Your Majesty, the final statistics. Over 10,000 former slaves have chosen to become cultural advisors. Another 20,000 specialists from various worlds have applied to join the exchange program." The queen rose, her royal robes catching the light of all 3 suns streaming through the crystal windows. "Then let us make it official." She pressed her hand to the ancient ceremonial scanner, while Sarah did the same. The great screens around the hall lit up with the new Interstellar Cooperation Treaty. One by one, representatives from each world added their signatures or equivalent marks of approval. "I remember when you first arrived," the queen said quietly to Sarah during the signing. "You were so careful to play the perfect slave." Sarah smiled. "And you were so careful to play the traditional queen. We've both come a long way." Indeed. The queen's scales shifted to a new pattern, one that the palace historians were already calling the color of change. "The traditional faction thought they were protecting our culture. They never understood that cultures must grow or die." As the ceremony concluded, Sarah received a private message from Earth Command. Her eyes widened as she read it. "Good news?" the queen asked, noting her expression. "They're promoting me," Sarah said, still surprised. "Permanent ambassador to Vajrax, with a special mandate to help implement similar programs across the galaxy." The queen's head frills danced with delight. "Perfect. Though I suppose this means you're technically no longer my slave." "No, Your Majesty," Sarah agreed with a laugh. "Now I'm just your friend." Looking out over the hall, where dozens of species mingled freely, sharing ideas and building bonds that would last generations, Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction. What had started as a simple undercover mission had evolved into something far more important, proof that any tradition, no matter how deeply rooted, could be transformed into something better. The queen's scales rippled one final time with all the colors of all her sons. "So, my friend, what shall we reform next?" Sarah grinned. "Well, I did hear the Draconian Empire still uses indentured servants. One revolution at a time." The queen laughed. "One revolution at a time." And in the great hall of the royal palace of Vajrax, the future of the galaxy looked brighter than all 3 suns combined.